Hello, you're watching TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. From the front line to the backstage, we bring you the latest from Ukraine this week. Ukraine and the United States have completed a revised 20-point peace plan intended as a framework to end the war. While talks in Miami produced no breakthrough last weekend, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy confirmed that he will meet Donald Trump this Sunday. He said the plan is 90% agreed, adding that a lot can be decided before the new year. Territorial issues, however, remains a key stumbling block. Meanwhile, Russian attacks continue, heavily targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, including strikes on Christmas Eve that killed at least 4 people and injured 35 others. On Friday, a Russian missile hit Uman, wounding 6 people, including 2 children. On the battlefield, Ukrainian troops retook Kupyansk, a vital railway hub. Russia is also trying to push Ukrainian forces out of the Pokrovsk area, while videos show Russian troops in Hulepole, where Ukraine says the situation remains difficult. We'll break down these developments with our guests, but first, let's take a look at this report from Ukraine this week.
U.S. President Donald Trump is expected to host Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy at Mar-a-Lago, Florida on Sunday to seek agreement on the U.S. peace plan. The meeting could signal significant progress, as Trump had previously said he would only meet Zelenskyy if a deal was close. This comes after the Ukrainian president revealed a new draft peace plan negotiated with the U.S. delegation during 3 days of talks in Miami. According to Zelenskyy, the document is 90% ready. Zelenskyy also spoke on Thursday with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. He described the discussions as productive.
There are good ideas that we discussed. There are some new ideas on how to bring the peace closer, and it concerns formats, meetings, and certainly the timeline. Some documents are already prepared. I can see that they are almost complete. Some documents are already complete. Of course, there is still work to be done on sensitive issues.
The draft reaffirms Ukraine's sovereignty and sets up a mechanism to monitor the contact line for lasting peace. It also includes strong security guarantees, including for Ukraine to maintain 800,000 troops in peacetime, and assurances from the US, NATO, and Europe, similar to NATO's Article 5. For the deal to take effect, Russia must withdraw from the regions it occupies. In the Donbas, both sides could recognize the current deployment line or create a demilitarized free economic zone under international supervision. That is how Zelenskyy himself commented on the draft.
Ukraine has never been and will never be an obstacle to peace. We are working actively and doing everything to ensure the agreement is finalized and that it's realistic.
From Moscow, there's been silence. However, media reports cite Kremlin-linked voices saying President Vladimir Putin has not ruled out a partial exchange of territories as part of a peace deal with Ukraine. However, this has not been officially confirmed by Moscow. Despite U.S. diplomatic efforts to end the war, Russia has shown no sign of stopping. Shelling continues without pause, even over Christmas, with massive attacks across the country. Over the past week, Russia launched more than 1,200 drones and 40 missiles at Ukraine, striking the cities of Uman, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Odessa, and wounding dozens of people. Russia also continues to launch hundreds of drones, destroying energy infrastructure and leaving hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians without heat in temperatures as low as -12 degrees Celsius.
For the 4th year in a row, Russia has tried to plunge Ukraine into darkness. Nearly every day, dozens or hundreds of drones and missiles strike energy facilities. Just since September, there have been almost 2,000 such attacks.
On the front line, intense fighting continues. Ukraine retook some positions north and northwest of Kupyansk after Russian forces captured the city center. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said the situation is difficult but stable. Ukrainian units blocked Russian advances in central Pokrovsk, where the fighting is still most intense.
Ukrainian defense forces continue to control the northern part of Pokrovsk. In the central part of the city, the Ukrainian soldiers are blocking the enemy's advance. In Mirnograd, Ukrainian units are holding defensive lines and eliminating the enemy on the outskirts of the city.
Meanwhile, multiple videos published by Russian media are circulating online, showing Russian military personnel claiming to have captured a command and observation post of the territorial defense forces in the center of Hulai Pole. Another video appears to be showing the Russian forces' presence in the city. According to Vladislav Voloshin, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Southern Defense Forces, an investigation into the video's authenticity is currently underway. Despite all diplomatic efforts, negotiations on a peace agreement seem to be going in circles. Each day, Russia continues to escalate attacks, a sign of Putin's unwillingness to end the war he started.
And joining us now is Peter Dickinson, Ukraine Alert Editor from Atlantic Council. Hello and welcome to Ukraine This Week.
Thanks for having me. It's great to join you.
So, of course, everyone's focused on the potential negotiation between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskyy that might take place this Sunday. Do you think that this is going to be mostly about territorial issues and questions about security guarantees?
Yes, they are the two main issues I think that'll be on the agenda. They are the two key points that are still undecided. But also, I think it's important to underline that we're talking here about negotiations between America and Ukraine, not between Ukraine and Russia, of course. So really what this is about for Ukraine, apart from the details of the actual, the terms that they agree on, is also demonstrating to Donald Trump that Ukraine is constructive in its approach to peace talks, that Ukraine is not, in other words, an obstacle to peace. President Zelenskyy was quite clear in comments today about Sunday's potential meeting that the goal was to demonstrate Ukraine's constructive approach, that Ukraine was a partner for peace, and presuming then that Russia does not show willing to meet Ukraine or the Americans halfway, that the conclusion should be, and hopefully from a Ukrainian perspective would be, that America and President Trump recognizes there's not enough pressure on Putin yet, and they need to increase the pressure. So it's all part of a very complex diplomatic game here that goes beyond the mere peace terms themselves and is also about where the different parties stand, and especially stand here. Where is America going to apply pressure? Is it going to keep pressuring Ukraine into concessions, or is it going to recognize that Ukraine is looking to make peace and that the problem really here is Russia, and that's where American pressure needs to be applied?
All right, you brought up a very good point here, this being a very, a complicated diplomatic back and forth that we're seeing right now, because observing this attempt at achieving a peace plan by the United States and the Trump administration, it does look a little bit like Groundhog Day, where some conversations were negotiated, Zelenskyy went to the Europeans, they went to the Americans, everything seems well until Trump went to talk to Putin and then things fall apart again. Do you think that with every cycle, though, at least Ukraine is pushing one step forward to getting the result that is more favorable to Ukraine, seeing that, like you mentioned, being able to demonstrate the constructive approach towards this negotiation?
Well, I mean, speaking frankly, I think that the goal here has to be to apply more pressure to Russia. At this stage, we don't really see any indications coming from the Russian side that they're ready to make concessions or to settle for a negotiated peace. Putin speaks quite openly about his maximalist goals, his continued commitment to achieving the goals of the invasion, which are essentially the ending of Ukrainian statehood, to establish a Russian protectorate over Ukraine at a minimum, perhaps even to erase Ukraine entirely as an independent nation state. So, there's really not anything to suggest that Putin's in the mood to compromise. He thinks he's still in a strong position. And so really these negotiations are a way for Ukraine, and to a lesser extent for Ukraine's European partners also, to kind of nudge Trump in that direction, to underline to him that he needs to take a lead here in applying pressure to the Russians. Since Trump came back to the White House in January, his most, the area where he's focused his peacemaking efforts on, if we can call them that, has been pressuring Ukraine. Since the very early days, since that infamous meeting in the Oval Office, we've heard often from Trump, Ukraine has no cards, that Ukraine had better make a deal soon, that things are going to get worse, and so on and so forth. And he seems to have decided that's the best way to end this war, by pressuring Ukraine as the weaker side in the war, on the side that's more dependent on America, rather than applying pressure to Russia. Now, the Ukrainians, of course, have a very different view, and I think that's shared by the Europeans, where they're saying, listen, if you want to end this, the only way you can do it is by pressuring the Russians. So this is all part, all these talks and peace plans and revised proposals are an effort to move Trump in that direction. Now, is it successful or not? Frankly, I think there's not a huge amount of success yet, but you never know. Trump is coming under pressure from his own domestic audience in America. The American public opinion and political opinion as well, I would say, generally is fairly strongly in support of Ukraine, and recognises that Russia is the issue here, that they must address Russia. So there's a lot of different factors weighing on Trump, and he has shown on occasion an inclination to get tougher. We saw the sanctions on Russia's energy, these big energy companies, just a month or so ago. So who knows what 2026 will bring, but certainly that's the goal, I think, the realistic goal for the Ukrainians and for their European partners, to try and underline to President Trump, the way to end this war is pressuring Russia. At this stage, we're not seeing enough pressure, and therefore we're not seeing any response from the Russians. They're happy to continue.
All right, so this gives us a good look at Ukraine's diplomatic offensive when it comes to the Washington, D.C., but I'm also curious about the European Union approach. We do know that no frozen assets from Russia has been utilized to help out Ukraine, but a EU loan of 90 billion euro is actually being utilized to keep Kyiv afloat. But what do you think will be the final decision for the Russian frozen assets? Do you think that it's going to be kind of stuck in deadlock forever, or is there a point where they would finally say, okay, you know what, let's just use this?
Well, I mean, we saw recently, it was a major test for the European Union, and essentially they failed that test. They chose not to use the frozen assets after having a number of European countries framed it, and the European Union officials themselves framed it really as a moment of truth for them, as a moment where Europe would have to decide, is it going to be a passive bystander in geopolitics? Is it going to be a serious geopolitical player? Or is it going to be a passive bystander as the fate of Europe is decided, essentially? And they really failed that test. Yes, they did come through with a large loan, which was a victory, a big win for Ukraine. But from a European Union point of view, I think they looked weak, they looked indecisive. There was clearly no real leadership there, certainly no consensus. And so you have to ask, if they couldn't make the decision at this critical juncture of the war in Ukraine, when really European security is on the table here. I mean, the future for Europe will be very, very bleak security-wise if Russia is allowed to succeed in Ukraine, and they know that. And they're also, at the same time as they're watching the Russians pummeling Ukraine, they're also seeing the Americans withdrawing back across the Atlantic, removing their security blanket that they've basically provided to Europe for decades. So this is a real crisis moment for European security, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't find the collective strength to make that decision regarding the frozen assets. So frankly, it's difficult to know what would provoke them to do so. I'd be very sceptical at this point, unless of course we're talking about a Russian collapse, at which point they might feel it's safer to do so. Maybe then they would. But at the moment, they've shown themselves, I think, to be very vulnerable to Russian intimidation.
Right, and I also want to focus on the attack on Ukraine recently. Russians been bombarding the energy infrastructure. I know you're in Kyiv right now yourself. Can you give us a little bit of a background of what's going on over there? Are you experiencing blackouts and power issues?
Yes, absolutely. The blackouts probably, I would say, this winter, this last month, are probably the worst of the war, or at least they're comparable to the very first winter of the war, where the blackouts got worse and worse, and there was a time where we felt, there was a widespread fear that maybe we'd completely, there would be a complete breakdown of the power system. It didn't happen then. It hasn't happened now yet, but we are experiencing rolling blackouts here in Kyiv. and across the country. Odessa, for example, the port city, Ukraine's main Black Sea port in the south, that's been heavily hit in recent weeks, and they've been suffering even worse blackouts, we're informed. So it's a major issue for Ukrainians, of course, and it's not just in terms of light, it's also heating for a lot of people. We have sub-zero temperatures now. It's proper winter here. We've got snow on the ground. It's minus 10 today, I think it was. And that's been the case for all week. So it's a really tough period for Ukrainians to survive and to manage. It's difficult for people just day to day in their lives. It's difficult for businesses to manage. It's difficult for people to organise. Especially of course the holiday period. It's not easy to organise Christmas dinner and New Year's celebrations when you don't even have power in your homes. Some people can't get out of their homes if they live up on the 12th floor of an apartment block, for example. So very complex time, very testing, and that's what it's all about. Russia is doing this because it wants to break Ukraine's spirit. The Russians are not able to achieve a victory on the front lines. They're not able to achieve a decisive breakthrough on the battlefield. So they're really trying to break Ukraine's will, break this incredible Ukrainian resilience that we've seen so much of in the last 4 years, and force the Ukrainians essentially to capitulate.
What do you read into these particular attack targeting infrastructure during the Christmas season? There's two lines of thinking. Some people believe that this is to, essentially gather more cards in anticipation for any sort of diplomatic or negotiation effort. But others are saying, the Russians don't really have any intention to stop the war, and these attacks is just another evidence of it.
Yeah, no, I think that I don't think the attacks on civilian infrastructure are part of their bargaining position in negotiations. I think what it does is it targets the civilian population to demoralize people, to undermine the will to resist. So they're looking to break Ukraine's spirit here, and they're looking to achieve a position where the Ukrainians who are in the country are calling on their own government to surrender, essentially, to accept Russia's terms, to end the war on any terms. And Russia's terms are the terms of capitulation. They're essentially saying, okay, we want to have a Russian puppet government in Kiev. We want to have Russia in control of Ukraine's domestic and foreign policy, and we want Ukraine to hand over around 25% of the country officially to Russia and to cede that land to Russia. So, the Russian terms are well known. And these attacks on civilian infrastructure are part of the campaign to get there, to break public opinion in Ukraine, because we've seen the polls still suggest that the vast majority of Ukrainians are strongly opposed to concessions in order to end the war, despite all the hardships they're going through. So the Russians feel they've got to keep up the pressure on the civilian population in order to somehow change that mood, to change that narrative, and to force the Ukrainians finally to give up, essentially.
Right. Another target that I've been observing is the increased attack on the railway and transportation infrastructure. We're talking about bridges and logistic infrastructure that connects Ukraine with the West, especially Poland as well. What do you read into those attacks? Do you think it's to cut off supply? Do you think it's to kind of warn the West in some way?
Yeah, I think that's probably most primarily an attempt to disrupt Ukraine's military logistics. And Ukraine is still receiving a lot of its materials for the war, a lot of its ammunition, weapons, transports, you name it, coming from Western partners, or also from Ukraine's own domestic production, which is also predominantly concentrated in the west of the country, further away from the front lines. So the railway in particular has played and is playing an absolutely crucial role in Ukraine's logistics. It's bringing the materials to the front lines that the country needs to defend itself. It's also playing an important part in the civilian life of the country. It's very important for the Ukrainian economy. It's very important for people moving around the country, for those who are traveling back and forth. Ukrainians have been massively displaced by this war. More than 12 million people, I think, have been displaced from their homes. Maybe the figure is actually higher than that. So staggering numbers, and they're very reliant on the railway network to be able to get around, to travel across the country, to visit family members who may now be living outside of Ukraine in the EU, for example. So again, it's all about disruption. It's about disrupting the war effort. It's about disrupting daily life for Ukrainians and making it harder for them, and also undermining the economy.
Right. And can you help us take a look at the frontline situation? Because for past couple of weeks, we've seen Russians struggling to actually gain a lot of ground, but they are kind of slowly but surely kind of inching towards more territory in Ukraine. However, recently we saw a situation in Huapolia where a video appeared with the Russian soldiers capturing a battalion. Of course, we still don't know the full story behind it yet, and the situation in Pokrovsk seems to be very difficult as well.
Well, we've seen over the course of the year actually quite a steady picture of minor Russian gains at the level of villages, meters, fields, for at very, very high cost. So I think if we take 2025 as a whole, the figures that we're seeing, the independent assessments suggest that Russia was able to gain overall around 0.6% of Ukrainian territory at a cost perhaps of hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed and wounded. So a very, very costly advance. But nevertheless, Russia is advancing. The message from the Kremlin is that Russia will always advance, that Russia is advancing everywhere and will continue to advance, and that Russian victory is inevitable. This has been Putin's message pretty consistently since the early stage of the war, but certainly this last year he's made a point of really hammering this message home that Russia's victory is inevitable. And essentially the idea here is then to persuade Ukraine's Western partners that resistance is futile. The situation is only going to get worse for Ukraine. It makes much more sense to do a deal now on Russia's terms. So Russia's been pushing that narrative very, very strongly. The big change, I would say probably the most significant development we've seen on the front lines in the last few months, maybe all year, but certainly the last few months, has been in the city of Kupyansk. Kupyansk is a major logistical hub in the north of Ukraine, in the Kharkiv region, close to the Russian border. Now, Putin claimed to have taken Kupyansk on multiple occasions. He even actually at one point invited journalists, international journalists, to come to Kupyansk and to watch the Russian victory. And he claimed that thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were encircled inside the city. Now, independent reports and certainly Ukrainian reports consistently indicate this was not the case, that the city was contested and Ukraine still held a large portion of it. In early December, President Zelenskyy actually went personally to Kupyansk and recorded a selfie video there to demonstrate to the world, essentially, that Putin was lying, that this was not the case, that they hadn't conquered the city. And in recent days, we've seen more reports from the Russian side acknowledging, essentially, that yes, Ukraine is winning the battle in Kupyansk and has liberated most of the city. It's largely now in Ukrainian hands. So this is a really interesting development because it underlines, A, that Putin is very prone to exaggerating Russian victories, and he's certainly not afraid to simply just tell lies. And that B, Ukraine is more than capable of regaining ground and achieving local victories at key points and regaining territory from the Russians. So this whole narrative of the inevitable Russian victory, inevitable Russian advances, is taking quite a battering in Kupyansk. So I think that's a really important point to make at this point, specifically about the developments there in Kupyansk.
All right. Last but not least, we are approaching the end of the year, and if you were to look back at the year 2025, what do you think would be the most pivotal moment for Ukraine during this year?
Well, I think everything really depends on in terms of the big picture. It's all about the international politics. It's all about Trump. It's all about Trump, and the picture with Trump has been very varied, as Trump himself is, very unpredictable, but broadly speaking, it's been quite negative. I think perhaps the outlook could be best described as, it could have been worse. When Trump came into office, it looked like it was going to be very bad. His first few months were marked by some really alarming statements about Ukraine, blaming Ukraine for the invasion, essentially suggesting Ukraine was finished and had to agree to any terms that Russia offered, and so on and so forth. And we've seen his position has sort of fluctuated over the year, but it's certainly not been as bad as some expected it to be. his conduct, his approach to Ukraine has been alarming for Ukrainians. It's been alarming for Europeans as well. So, I mean, it's really been a year of major shifts geopolitically, where we've seen the Ukrainians understand that they really can't rely on America anymore, and it's seen the Europeans understand that they've got to learn to defend themselves as well, because they also can't expect America to stand in there and play the role it has historically. So I think if we take 2025 as a whole, it's been the year where Ukraine and Europe have understood that they are now basically, their fates are very much intertwined. Ukraine has to defend itself, and it has to look to Europe, and Europeans have to look to Ukraine now as their first line of defense.
Mr. Peter Dickinson, Ukrainian Elder Editor, Atlantic Council's our guest, and thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of Ukraine This Week. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.